Well, hello, everyone. I'm Stephen Goldberg of Optimus Performance, bringing you practical tips and ideas on leadership, team development, and employee performance in the workplace. As you can see, I have a special guest with me today. Richard Rierson is a leadership coach, but much more than that. He's actually a full-time airline pilot as well. I know there has to be a lot of leadership involved with flying a plane and managing that whole experience. Richard is known for his highly rated Dose of Leadership podcast and his ability to transform individuals and cultures. For him, it's about being intentional on being composed, confident, consistent, courageous, and compassionate in every aspect of our lives. Those are some great C words. I guess they're all starting with C. Five C's of leadership is, I guess, C's. A good topic. So leadership, Richard got the leadership bug, was implanted in him during his 10 years as an active duty Marine Corps officer and pilot. In 2001, he landed his dream job as a professional airline pilot, but that dream was cut short after the tragic events of 9/11, of course. This furlong thrust him into the corporate arena, where he spent the next 16 years putting into practice those unique leadership lessons he learned from his time as a Marine and professional aviator. And I know that, like in my leadership training, I know a lot of the practices came out of the Army or the Navy, I'm not sure. And those are great practices. For Richard, it's about creating cultures of decentralized decision-making, where the leadership burden is spread throughout the entire organization, where everyone thinks and acts as a leader, where authenticity, transparency, and vulnerability become powerful keys to unlocking purpose, results, and significance. So, of course, I took this, Richard, from your website. And I'd like to welcome you again. And maybe you could start by telling us your story about how you transitioned into coaching businesses and leaders. And I think you had mentioned you work with small, medium-sized businesses. So what propelled you into that? What's your story there?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me on, Stephen. I do appreciate this, and it's always fun to talk to a fellow leadership junkie for sure. So I appreciate your kindred spirit in this. But yeah, it kind of, I guess you could say, I fell into it in the sense that because of, when I landed that job at American in 2001, I thought, okay, this is great. I love flying. Aviation's in my blood. It's something I do really well. I enjoy it, and I thought I was set for life. And then finished my training on the 8th of September, and 11th of September was my first day of official day after training. And so I flew 6 times, and then I was thrust in, like I said, in the corporate arena. And the mindset at the time was, oh my God, what am I going to do? All I know how to do is fly airplanes. That's what I was thinking. And as I started working in the real world, and as a shipping supervisor was my first job, all those lessons started coming as I was away from it, as I was away from the Marine Corps, as I was away from flying planes and forced to kind of reinvent myself. All those lessons that I took for granted started to come into focus. For example, the Marine Corps is big about, leaders, as an officer, leaders eat last. There's a mindset in the Marine Corps is that the middle and below, which in the Marine Corps would have been your staff NCOs, your enlisted and below, the people that are on the front lines that are, kicking down doors and putting bullets down range and all that other stuff. That's the real engine of the Marine Corps. And the officer corps was equated to the civilian side is, that's kind of your mid-level management and above, right? And so this kind of combination of creating a culture where people are asking for forgiveness instead of permission, that middle and below, that engine is empowered to make decisions without asking for permission. And that's by necessity, right? Because it's a combat environment, and combat's the ultimate in chaos. And so to thrive in that chaos, you can't have this kind of bureaucratic hierarchical culture where the person's on the front line sees a situation and says, oh, can I go blow up that building or kill those bad guys? Well, let me get permission first. Well, by the time that it went up the chain and came back down, you've lost that opportunity. So in an effort to combat or defeat stagnation and mediocrity, the Marine Corps by necessity has to embrace this thriving in a chaotic environment. And the only way that you can do that is by making sure the middle and below are empowered to ask for forgiveness instead of permission. But to avoid chaos, lessen the chaos aspect of it, the senior leadership have to be maniacally focused on communicating the intent of what we want to accomplish and why. And so it's that combination of the senior leadership, the middle and senior leadership, 100% focused on what are we trying to accomplish and why. And if the middle and below knows that, then they're empowered to make all these decisions that, in theory, support the intent, right? And so that's why I get passionate about decentralized decision making. And that really is the reason why the Marine Corps is so successful at what they do. They have this environment. And then when I got in the business world, I saw that, well, I just assumed you're $1 million, $20 million company, that you kind of understood those basic concepts. And it's very command and control in the business world for generally speaking, old school command and control. I'm the owner. I created this baby, from when I was, this is my company. It's my money, my blood, sweat, and toil on the line here. You're just a worker. Do what I say. And that was what I entered into found when I entered the corporate arena. And I've been bucking it ever since and trying to enlighten people that know, yes, this is your company, but you're going to be, because it's chaotic, right? To sit there and say that business isn't chaotic, we're kidding ourselves, right? And I see a lot of leaders or CEOs and middle-level managers trying to come up with all these processes, procedures, rules, and regulations to kind of quell the chaos and to get their workers to be mind-numb robots and just follow the plan. And it never works, right? It never works. Every organization I've worked in, I'll never forget one place that I worked, and they said, I think it was 2010. It was a brand new year, and the CEO came out. So 2010 is going to all be planning. We're going to be the best planners on the planet, because without good plans, you can't have good execution. And I kind of recoiled at that. And trust me, I like plans. I need plans. I have detailed flight plans every time I take off from here to Paris, right? I have a ton of waypoints, and I need to know what that plan is for sake of resources, to know if I'm ahead of time. Am I leaking fuel? Am I going to get there with enough fuel? All that kind of stuff. But I'm more concerned about the outcome rather than all the individual waypoints, right? I don't celebrate, when I fly over New York City and my 20th waypoint, my way to Paris, and I celebrate if I'm ahead or, I don't celebrate that I got there on time with the exact amount of gas that the plan said. I don't care. I mean, I only do that for resource purpose. I care about getting everybody to Paris, right? So at some point that plan will become useless because I'll dodge a thunderstorm. We'll have to divert. Something will happen. And that's why I just look at plans differently. And what I found in the corporate arena, people are using plans to have this perfect execution. I look at planning to be prepared for the inevitable unforeseen. And that's what the Marine Corps taught me. So I kind of going down a bunch of tangents there. You get me to start talking, I'm not going to shut up. So
that's okay. So
your question,
bring this back. You were going to say?
You were asking how I got into this, right? You were going to say the question was, how did I get into this? Well, so as I started working in the real world and seeing and started applying some of these Marine Corps principles and some of these principles that I do that are necessary for flying planes too. And I started seeing success. And again, I'm not the sharpest knife in the drawer. And I just started applying it. And I started seeing success. I started getting more responsibility, more accountability, more lucrative positions, more opportunities. I kept going to different companies and I just kind of kept climbing the ranks and getting paid more along the way. And at one point, I was a VP of operations for a company, and we were training our property managers. It's a hotel company. And the HR folks at the end of their 6-week training, I would come in and give them kind of a full day of my kind of off the cuff expectations as a leader. I wanted them to think and act like leaders. And I would tell them all these kind of cool stories of being in the Marine Corps equating, and this is my expectation, and I want to create this culture of forgiveness, not permission. I mean, you need to think and act like a leader. And at the end of their surveys, their 6-week training, everybody started saying that their favorite part of the training was my impromptu leadership speech. And they kind of pushed me, these HR training folks, that you could get paid doing this. And so I finally took the leap and listened to them and put up a website. And I was looking for keynote speeches. And through fate or happenstance, after about 2 weeks after putting up this kind of crappy website, this is 2007, by the way, I got a call from Detroit, Michigan State Police, the guy that ran it. And he said, hey, and he was a Marine, a prior Marine. So we hit it off. And he goes, could you do, I'm looking for a full day leadership training seminar from my troopers. They come in once a year. We do this leadership conference. Could you do all day training? And I just said yes, even though I didn't have any training. All I had was a 15-minute PowerPoint presentation. That's all I had. But I said yes. And he said he would pay me $8,000. And I was like, whoa. And went off and figured out how to turn that 15-minute presentation into an all-day training event with some help with some other consultants here in town, some other mentors. And I walked out with that check and thinking, man, I'm going to be rich doing this. This is so easy. Well, I think that was the universe telling me this is how it can be. And it's never been that easy ever since. I've had to put in a lot of grind and building an audience and building trust and relationships, but that gave me the taste. I do think that was universe kind of saying, this is how it can be. Now go do the work. And so that's how I got into it. And it was started out as just keynotes. And as I started doing keynotes, at the end, people would come up to me and say, hey, would you mind coaching me or coaching my son or coaching this manager? And I'd never done it before. And I just said yes to every time that somebody asked me. I just said yes and figured out the details later as I went along. And
I guess,
and then eventually that led to, it led to more consulting, which is what I like to do now, which is kind of general, insert me into the organization as an arrow in your quiver. And whatever the situation is with strategy, is it marketing? Is it, communication? Is it retention? Is it acquisitions? Whatever. There's always a leadership umbrella around all of those things. And I just like to help companies around all of that.
So you're kind of like this problem solver that helps companies fix problems that is holding them back, I guess you could say.
Yeah.
You mentioned something I just want you to elaborate on. You say you teach people, or you were speaking about how to act and think like a leader. So tell us about that. What does it mean to act and think like a leader? Like anybody in the organization, I guess is what you're saying, can act and think like a leader, and that's going to make the organization much more able to perform if everybody's acting and thinking like a leader. But maybe somebody may feel threatened by that, other leaders. But explain what you mean by that. What does that look like?
Yeah, great question. And it's all about influence, right? I mean, and I think a lot of times we, as particularly for frontline stakeholders in an organization, a lot of it's mindset, right? We don't realize how much influence we have. I love finding the real influencers in an organization. And so often those influencers are usually they're customer facing employees or people that are on the front lines, if you will, of the factory, who is running this spot welding machine, whatever, there's so many influential leaders of a brand and organization that go unrecognized. And I like to kind of discover them or let them discover that themselves. Because I think a lot of it has to do first and foremost as a mindset. They don't realize how much influence they have. Take, for example, even in the airline industry, and this bothers me tremendously, even with a company that I work for. You've got so many of these high paid, highly educated, upper level management, and they think that that's the key to dragging this business out of the mud. Okay, a certain aspect of it is sure. I mean, from setting the vision and where we're taking this and why we're taking it there. That's where I see it come in. But too often I see these senior and mid-level managers they have to have all the answers. When in reality, like take for the case of the airline that I work for, to me, the customer facing roles have way more influence on the brand than any of these muckety mucks at the upper level. Right. And I think sometimes the muckety mucks at the upper level think they have so much impact on the brand when really it's the gate agents, the flight attendants for sure, to a lesser extent, us, the pilots, because we have to shut the door now, so they don't have a lot of interaction with us. But the more that they can give us some autonomous decision making with those three, and the mechanics too, the maintenance folks, those have such a huge impact on the brand. And there's a lot of leadership that goes wasted because people don't realize how much influence they have on driving the success of this brand. And I think sometimes we rest on our laurels if we're not identified on the org chart as leaders. We're thinking we just kind of wait around for the leaders, and when things go wrong, we kind of blame them. I'm kind of like, look, we're all in this together. Don't let this organization crash into the mountain. If you see something, you have impact, you have influence, and particularly those customer facing roles. And I think a lot of times employees don't realize that they are in leadership roles, even though they're not designated per se in their title or on the org chart. And so to think and act like a leader means, the basic, you don't have to go to a course, get a degree, a certificate to say yes to leadership. You just need to kind of to raise your hand. And it's all those things you talked about in those 5 C's. If you can be composed in a stressful situation, if you can be confident not only in yourself, but in the people that you're around or maybe you're accountable for, maybe you just got 2 or 3 people in a little team. If consistent in everything that you do, do what you say you're going to do. There's a dearth of people that just they say they're going to do something and they never do it in every level of the organization. So composed, confident, consistent, courageous, and choose to be courageous. Do you speak up or do you stay silent? Right? Do you exhibit moral courage and you stop something? I mean, all of those are leadership traits, and then certainly compassion. Right? Looking at other people and realizing, trying to, with empathy, well, why are they acting this way? Particularly if they're throwing barbs at you. If you can do that from a compassionate, okay, why is this person losing his temper? Why is he calling me a jerk? Am I a jerk? Well, I don't know. Why does he see that way? And trying to put yourself in there, then you're thinking and acting like a leader. And so that's why I came up with those 5 C's, because if you think of that, because a lot of times people think leadership is about being this larger than life figure walking into a room like John Wayne with a booming voice and some swagger and saying, come on, team, follow me through the gates of hell, and we think that's what leadership is. And I suppose in some aspect that
in the
charismatic,
movies.
In the movies, right? Everybody kind of falsely equates leadership with charisma. And if you got charisma, that's great. But if you're an introvert like me, I don't do so well when I walk into a room of a bunch of people and try to rally the troops. But if I can, no matter what my personality characteristics, introvert, extrovert, shy, outgoing, whatever, every single one of us, can choose to be composed, can choose to be confident, can choose to be consistent, can choose to be courageous, and certainly can choose to be compassionate. And if you do those 5 things, you're going to develop a command leadership presence that's authentically you. And that's thinking and acting like a leader in my book.
So, yeah, it sounds familiar. I used to deliver a course called Pride, Personal Responsibility and Developing Excellence. And it was about just embracing kind of those types of qualities and living them, in the moment every day. And that's what, personal leadership is all about. So how do you work with your clients, and who are your typical clients, by the way? Like what size, who you mentioned you work with all different departments, but who would typically hire you? Would it be the business owner, and what size company?
Yeah, it's typically the CEO or usually hires me, and the decision maker. I mean, I have come in and gone in at the HR level, at the director, if they're the decision maker. There's been a handful of those, but typically I find that they still have to get the CEO's approval. So I like to talk with the C-suite, and I'm looking for mid to small level companies. The larger the company, the harder it is, because it's just by nature, it's bureaucratic, right? And you've got to battle a lot of bureaucracy, which I'm not really into.
And,
So I like
what
that kind
are,
of.
right. What would be the, if you're, let's say, going in or you're called into a medium-sized company, let's just say 100-employee type company would be a good-sized medium company, and the CEO or the president, the owner wants you to help him. What typically is the problem that he has in his head that he wants you to solve, and what is the problem you see that he has? Because sometimes they differ, right? The perceptions are different. You're looking at it from the outside and he's experiencing something that he wants fixed.
Well, what I've seen, I mean, in a general, every situation is different, but I think some commonalities that I've seen, certainly what I've been involved in, is you've got a situation where the business wants to scale, right? They've hit a plateau. And the reason why they can't scale is because it feels like the CEO and the senior leadership feel like they're inserted too low in the organization. In fact, they're just doing too much of the kind of the day-to-day grind and reacting to the day-to-day kind of latest emergency or fire for the moment, right? And they can't get out of that reactionary day-to-day grind, and so they're wanting to start thinking strategically.
Even though they read the latest book on planning, right?
right, exactly, right. And so they're scrambling to find ways, and you see them. They're hiring some consultant to come in and do Six Sigma. They're coming in to do EOS, which again, nothing against the systems per se. So some of them really good, or coming up with a new software program that's going to break the communication barrier channels down, and it's going to keep everything in processes and this and that. And not because I've done all that too, right? I've been guilty of all of that. And really what I see, again, that's why I go back to this kind of decentralization thing is it's getting people to think and act like leaders, or at least taking the time as the senior leadership to take a pause, like, what do we try, and answer the question, what are we trying to accomplish here? And that's what I find most organizations aren't doing, is they're buried in something. They haven't taken the time because they feel like they haven't had the time to take a pause and go, okay, what is it we're really trying to accomplish? And start looking and thinking, there's got to be somebody at a handful of people in the organization who are thinking like, this is what this organization is going to look like 6 to 8 months from now. I don't care. I'm not talking 5-10 years. I mean, I think that's a waste, right? Because you just can't look. That's too far ahead. I think if you're looking 6 to 8 months, somebody has to be saying, what does this look like in 6 to 8 months from now? And somebody has to always be communicating that. And that's where I see a lot of the senior leadership stuck, is because they're still trying to figure out how to, deal with the latest crisis of the moment. And so to do that, where I help them get in is just like, okay, let's take a pause. And then I really like working with the middle and below and getting them to understand these concepts of leadership. And that's when you start to see things kind of turn around. Instead of being dependent on, like I was telling you earlier, instead of waiting for the senior leaders to tell me what to do, now well, what do you think is the best thing we should do? Well, it would be better if we did it this way. Okay, then let's do that. Well, it's going to mean that we got to buy it. Okay, well, let's just go buy it and we'll figure it out later, right? I mean, I know it's kind of, and CEOs don't like to hear me talk about something like that, but what they got to understand is if they are communicating the intent, it's amazing what people will do when you build the sandbox for somebody. And that's the problem, is that the sandbox is never defined. And if I can get the senior leaders to define the sandbox, and it's clearly defined, and I know what I can play in, all the resources, all the toys that I got in my sandbox, and communicate to my mid-level managers and below that, hey, just go ahead and play and do this. I want you to play in the sandbox. When you get to the edge or you think you need more sand, then come talk to me. But until then, go make it happen. And that's where I'd spend my time, trying to get the senior leaders to build the sandbox. And then I've really found is it takes a lot of effort and energy, particularly in organizations, to get the middle and the below to start playing in the sandbox, because there's a lot of people in there that's been so accustomed that they're kind of waiting to be told what to play with, instead of, look, you can play in this whole big sandbox. It's yours. Because what we're trying to do is this. And it takes work. It sounds simple in theory. It sounds simple to talk about, oh yeah, in theory, but to actually do it, it takes a lot of effort.
Well, when you have to go, check with your manager every time you want to make a decision that's kind of like different or a little bit outside of what you're confident making because you haven't been given that latitude.
Yes.
Yeah, it's like, well, but that's what bogs things down, right? Is if
absolutely
employees have to always go back and ask for permission to do something, and then the manager maybe has to go ask permission somewhere else, or so yeah, I get it. Decentralized leadership, is that what you call it?
Yeah, and
so it's kind of like
decentralized. Yeah, a decentralized culture of leadership where
decision
the senior leaders. Yeah, where the senior leaders are focused on communicating intent, and that is not easy. It sounds easy. A lot of people think, oh, I'll just send an email or I'll just do. It takes like every conversation, every thought has to be reinforcing the intent of why this is where we're going, and this is why we're going that way. And once you have that defined, that's like having the Constitution. You can say, or the Bill of Rights, if you will, and you can say, hey, this is what we said we were going to do. Why are we doing this? Because this doesn't line up with what you said, right? That's the power behind that. That's the power behind the decision-making. You're getting the middle and below to kind of go in this direction. You got something. And so that really is the senior leadership's job, is communication. And I cannot
this is more important right now than ever before, I think, because of the disruptions we've been going through in the workplace, from just the availability of skilled people, driven a lot by obviously the pandemic we've just been through, but also by technology. I was just reading an article about 5G, and this is like gonna the potential for huge disruption. And if the business owner wants to scale but is tied down too much in the day-to-day firefighting emergencies and isn't set back enough from the organization, him and his top management, to work on strategic thinking and that whole communicating, where are we going, and having that compass, well, you could be headed for disaster, because so many changes looks like they're on the horizon, and you need to have the time and the focus to think, how is this going to impact our company? Where are the threats? Where are the opportunities? How are we going to navigate this? And the only way to do that is to give up certain control and trust people that they're going to make. And I love that analogy about, creating that sandbox. And so, let's just go back to that business owner. They're smart people. They've read a lot of books on leadership, yet a lot of them are still struggling with this giving up control or keeping too much control. Why is that, do you think? What is, because it's something that's obviously inside, needs to be triggered. That change has to happen inside. What's the thing that's holding them back inside as leaders, as business owners, CEOs, whatever you want to call them?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think it goes back to, I think it's we've bought into this myth as leaders that a lot of this, what I say here is or a byproduct of all of this kind of decentralized leadership culture, is that really at the heart of it is creating, kind of a subheadline would be being the composed force in a chaotic situation. And I think there's this myth, we're thinking that there's something wrong. We think there's something wrong with us as individuals and as an organization as a whole, is that we never feel like we can get anything done. There's never enough time. But that's just the reality of the world, And I think a lot of times people bang their head on an individual level. I know if you're just thinking about self-help, I mean, even if in your own self as an individual, like limiting beliefs and self-doubt. I mean, you got up this morning, Stephen, taking your shower, and I'm sure you said some negative things about yourself or had some negative thoughts about yourself that you would never tell anybody else. And I think I used to think there was something wrong with me that I had that thoughts until I realized that everybody has those thoughts. They never go away, by the way, no matter how much therapy and self-help that you do. Not that you shouldn't do therapy and self-help.
Oh,
you
darn.
should. Yeah, right. But I think we get to this point that we think, oh, there's something wrong with me that I have. There's nothing wrong with you. That's just being a human being. And it's the same thing with an organization, that there's never enough time to get everything done. And I equate it to, and I see a lot of people just stressed about that. And that's, again, the thing that the Marine Corps taught me is like the analogy they gave me early on. They're like, look, this is a chaotic business. You're always going to have a bag with 100 pounds of rocks in it. And those 100 pounds of rocks seem important. And you feel like you got to get that bag empty. The bag's never empty. It's always at 100. There's always 100 rocks in the bag. Always. And there's a bunch of rocks around the bag. It's your job as a leader to make sure you've got the right 100 rocks in the bag, if that makes sense, right? It sucks that you got to carry around a bag with 100 rocks in it, or 100 pounds, or however you want to equate it. And that's just kind of the bird. It's kind of like Atlas carrying the globe, right? That's the price of admission to doing things of significance and consequences, is that you have to carry around this bag 100 with 100 pounds or 100 rocks in it. And then your job is not to make sure that the rocks get empty, but it's to make sure you're carrying the right rocks, if that makes sense. And it's about prioritization and getting comfortable with the fact that this is a chaotic business, and that if as a leader, if you can be the composed force within that chaotic situation, that's the competitive edge. That's when things start to turn around and you start working on the right things. And it's having an outcome-based mindset as opposed to a reactionary mindset. And that's what decentralization does. It gets you focused on what we're trying to accomplish and why, because there's a shitload of dragons out there. And if I feel like I got to kill all the dragons, I'm going to eventually succumb to the dragons. But if I can sit there and go, well, what's the right dragon that I need to kill right now? Oh, it's that one that's sitting on the pot of gold. This one's just making a lot of noise, but that's the dragon I need to slay. So let's go kill that dragon right now. And too often I see business owners and leaders, going back to your original question, is they're freaked out that there are dragons, if that makes sense. And what I try to say is like, just get comfortable with the dragons and let's just make sure we're killing the right ones. So it's less about living in a world where we've got smooth processes. I hate the term. I love it when a plan comes together. Well, we all do, but rarely do plans ever work out like initially intended. But we need to do it, but we do it because there's going to be an unexpected dragon somewhere, and I'm just waiting for it. And so instead of freaking out when the dragon pops up out of the ground and jacks up my plan, I'm ready for it. And so I spend my limited time, energy, and resources, instead of being a perfect planner, I spend my limited time, energy, resources of being a dragon slayer and being prepared to slay dragons. And to me, that's the difference between management and leadership. The leader is a dragon slayer. The manager, the effective manager, the manager of things, that's the planner. The leader's a dragon slayer, and he's ready for the dragon. And he hates fighting the dragon. I mean, we don't like fighting dragons. They're scary, but if we got to, we do it, and then we celebrate. And then the professional, after that dragon is slayed, we celebrate that. Hey, and we drink a glass of wine or a beer and pat each other on the back. And then we know that there's going to be another one tomorrow. And I'm okay with that. And that's what I try to get. That's what I see in CEOs and particularly entrepreneur CEOs, guys that started them up, guys and gals, and they reach a certain point and they plateau, right? And they can't, because they got to start letting go. And it's scary as hell to let go. I get it. I'm not one of those entrepreneurs, but I can see it. And I know why they're scared, because they've done it. They started it from their garage.
Yeah. It's hard to let go.
And now they've got
when you start up,
employees.
You have to be in charge of everything because you have nobody else. And you start, adding a person here, a person there, or whatever. And, but you still have your hands almost on everything, but you can't do that forever. So to go back to that problem, let's say, of scaling and letting go, you're teaching you're helping them define that sandbox for the employees, but the employees need to go through a transformation as well.
Absolutely.
To take on those leadership qualities. How do you make that transition happen? Is it through the training you bring, the coaching? How does that process look like? What is that?
Yeah, I think for me, I think in the beginning, and even as I worked in business in the time I was in the corporate arena, I was guilty of this too. I used to think I got to get everybody rowing in the same direction, or I got to, okay, I've got 150 employees. I got to make sure all 150 employees understand these concepts. That would be great. It's not realistic. And so what I found is most effective is, it's kind of the 80-20 rule. It's like 80% of your work is really being done by 20% of your employee, the high performers and employees, right? I mean, and so that's just the laws of nature. And so embrace the 80-20 rule. And so instead of spending, all my energy, on 80, trying to get 80% of the organization going the same way, I find those 20% of those high performers and I kind of get them that they become like the brand ambassadors of what we're trying to do. And every situation you can find, and then it doesn't become so overwhelming. And that's just general guidance for any CEO who's trying to change the culture. Eventually you can get everybody, but just find those, that 20% of those high performers, those people who get it, and pour 80% of your love into them. Now you got to leave that 20 other percent for the other 80 who don't necessarily get it or just kind of, individual contributors and this and that. And that's great. You can't forget them, but you've got to spend the bulk of your love on that 20% of those high performers and changing the culture. And I find that that's the most effective. And so what I do when I go in and I try to find those, who are those high performers, who are those, and depending what the personality of the CEO is like, 9 times out of 10, that CEO is wanting that they don't have enough time. They feel like they need to be free, like I said, to think that up. So I find those high performers that can kind of carry those torches of the CEO. And then you start seeing the culture shift. And I try to do that in every department. Sometimes you just need 2 or 3.
Yeah, that's fair. That makes a lot of sense. Yeah. Work with your top performers who tend to be the 20%. Mm-hmm. And they, like you say, will become your influencers on the rest of the people, because you always have somebody, when you go through a transformation, that involves people shifting their behaviors and their mindset, you're always going to have those that are resistant, right? And you need your ambassadors to kind of like be the torchbearers, right? And be able to confront those people too, because you're going to have you could draw that sandbox, but how well are everybody going to play together? They have to learn to play just like kids. You put them in there, and sometimes you have to intervene, but you want to, when they're not in the sandbox, teach them some good life skills so they know how to get along with each other. And I guess that's where the training component should come in, right? You want to give them those, get them in touch with some of those ideas or those 5 C's on leadership. And then let them loose together and see how well they can get along and implement those things when the coach and the trainer is not around, right? It's easy to do in a training room, but
it is. But I mean, in real life. But when you really play in a sandbox, like I said, as a kid, it gets dirty, right? Your jeans get kind of wet, your knees get wet and kind of muddy, and your fingernails get dirty, and that's okay. And I think that's another aspect. I think when people go down this idea of embracing leadership or decentralized cultures of leadership or embracing change in cultures, is that, it is messy and it's okay. And conflict isn't necessarily a bad thing. In fact, I highly encourage it. Respectful conflict, right? I think that's where a lot of times is getting comfortable. Like, how do we, as we're playing in the sandbox, and that same analogy is like, well, that's my truck. Well, I want to play with it right now. No, I don't, and we may get in a fight. And I think sometimes people are so afraid of that, afraid of disagreeing, afraid of conflict, afraid of kind of passion and heated debate. You got to walk a fine line. It can certainly be, there's a right way to do it, respectful.
Well, the more you empower people, and especially in their teams, to make decisions, not have to rely on management, the more potential disagreements you're going to have to come to an agreement
Absolutely.
or consensus. And so people need to learn that that's normal. You know, we all get into arguments with each other in our families, whatever, and it's about working through that, listening to each other, and, you know, being heard and acknowledging, and then adapting what is the best plan. You know, what's the best, if we're all need to come to consensus on that decision, we need to listen to each other and go with what is the best idea or the most practical, whatever criteria you use, right?
Yeah, I mean, it sounds so easy talking about it here. You're right, but that empathetic listening, the getting rid of our ego, it's hard work. I mean, it's not easy. It's so hard, and it's what's really hard about it too is even when we get, say, you get the organization going in that way, and empower, and people are making decisions at lower levels and doing things, and it's, you know, at some point there's going to be, like you said, to your point, a disagreement, an argument, you know, and the world that I come from, like if you and I are peers and our boss said something and we need to figure out, I mean, you and I behind closed doors, maybe hash it out. There may be some name calling. I mean, passionate. And maybe you're my boss. Better example is you're my boss and I'm arguing with you. I'm like, Stephen, I don't think this is right. And you're like, you know, and if you're listening to me, and at some point, you know, you slap your hand on the table and say, Richard, I've heard everything you said. I appreciate everything you said. I love this spirited debate, but I'm going to have to go with my original decision. This is what I'm going to have to do. We're going to do it my way. And this is where leadership gets really hard. But if you can do this, you're well on your way to being an outstanding organization. Is if I can walk out that, I'm like, all right, Stephen, thank you for hearing me out. And I still hate your decision. I still hate it. I think it's wrong. But I've had my shot. And when I walk out that door, I had better be communicating that decision like it was my own. And no one better see or get any hint of how I don't support it. That to me is that's at the leadership pinnacle. If you got people doing that, you're unstoppable. What happens typically is I'll go out and I'm like, Stephen, he's a knucklehead. I tried to fight for you guys, but this is what we got to do. Fucking Stephen. You know, and now I've just totally poisoned the organization. I've done such a huge disservice to you as a leader, right? I mean, now if you're asking me to do something immoral or illegal, unethical, I'll stand on my moral courage cross and bear the consequences, right? You know, but if you're
and if we go back to the Navy Army situation, I mean, you better, if your commander is making a decision and saying this is how we have to do it, now it turns into a life and death situation in a lot of cases. And if you're not on board, you could be killing your squadron, you know, because there's a disconnect completely. So, but it's the same thing. It really applies to the organization, to a private business for sure. I could see that.
Yeah, there's a saying that we had in the Marine Corps, and then I say it and I bring it in aviation too. It's like, you know, if I'm flying, because 9 times out of 10, when I'm flying at the level of, you know, commercial professional aviation, you know, 9 times out of 10, you don't know who you're going to be flying with that day. So it's the first time you're flying with this person. And, you know, I want people to know if I'm the captain, you know, it's not your right to challenge me. It's your obligation. I don't care how good or bad of a pilot you think I'm in. I don't care if you think I'm grumpy, aloof, competent. I don't care. It's not your right to challenge me. It's your obligation. In fact, it's our right to challenge each other. It's our obligation to challenge each other. And that's the concept that you want to have in your organization. It's not your right to challenge me as your CEO. It's your obligation to challenge me respectfully, right? And not just to challenge for challenge sake. You know, too often you see people just that's a stupid idea. Well, why is it a stupid idea? I don't know. I just don't like it. You know, if you're going to say it's a stupid idea, well, what's your idea? You know, that's what I expect as the CEO. You know, challenge me. You know, I'm not the smartest
Come
guy.
up with something better.
Here.
Yeah. Don't just challenge me. Just don't tell me you don't like it. Come up with something better.
Yeah.
So, Richard, if there's, is there one valuable free action or recommendation that the audience can implement that will help them solve the problem of not being able to give up the control so that they could work on what's most important as a leader for their business, to have that time. What is one recommendation or free action that you would give to this audience listening now?
Yeah. One thing that I want everybody who's listening to understand, and this is probably I find myself in coaching and consulting situations talking about this constantly. Because as human beings, we're always in this natural state of reaction, right? I think that's how we're wired as human beings, is to react. And I think that has to do with biology and how we were raised, in the wild, having to react if a saber-toothed tiger comes around the corner, right? I have to react. But that reaction is so, what separates us from all the other animals in the animal kingdom is this ability to choose how to react. And that is at the heart of leadership. So if I see people who are struggling with leadership, from the top CEO to the person who's never seen themselves as a leader before, was if you find yourself in that kind of reactionary situation, and that can be anything. That can be an irate customer. It can be a fight with your significant other. It can be a deadline that's fast approaching and you're not even close to getting done. When you find that anxiety that's getting ready to well up and you're about to react, the moment that you can sit there and just pause, and I call it the leadership pause, that you can just pause and you can just sit there and go, okay, wait a second. What am I trying to accomplish here? Or how do I react to this? Just by asking one of those two questions. The moment you do that, you stop the reaction cycle and you've stepped into the leadership circle. And that in itself starts the leadership process. And if people know that and understand that, that's how easily accessible leadership is. It doesn't mean that leadership is easy. Don't misunderstand what I said, because how you choose to react next may be very difficult and take a tremendous amount of courage to do, right? To do the right thing, to not do something, to stop what we've been doing, to put the brakes on this 6-month project we're killing it. The moment you stop reacting and you choose to pause and ask those questions, what am I trying to accomplish here? What is the outcome that I'm going for? How do I react to this in the moment? You've instantaneously stepped into a leadership role. And so that's my piece of advice, is like, don't react, choose to create, choose to pause and think about it. That comes from aviation too. We're taught that all the time. When you see that flashing red light and that bell, it's easy to react to that. Oh, fire light, put it out. We're always taught to not do anything. That it was called hack the clock. They said, before you do anything, just punch the stopwatch on the clock. Doesn't do anything to alleviate the abnormal situation that's happening in the cockpit. But just by pressing that stopwatch. And then the other thing that we do is somebody says, I have the aircraft. And they found psychologically, because when something happens in the cockpit, it's usually a startle effect, right? It's like, oh, what? And we want to react. But if somebody says, I have the aircraft, that's the equivalent of someone punching the stopwatch on the clock. It stops the brain from reacting and it gets you in a leadership mode. And so that's my free advice, is take a pause and choose not to react and ask yourself, what am I doing?
Be conscious. Mm-hmm. And I like that question. What is my intent? Where do we want to get to? Mm-hmm. So I guess my final question, what's the one question that I should have asked you that would give great value to our audience?
Wow.
If I didn't ask it already, I don't know.
Oh, this has been such a fun conversation. I would think, you kind of asked it, but I guess what is leadership? And that I want everybody to realize that leadership isn't about position or title. It's not about anything other than being composed, confident, consistent, courageous, and compassionate. And that's a choice. And no matter what your personality, no matter what your position, no matter where you're at, you have a level of influence. And whether you like it or not, you're going to be called to leadership, and I ask that question sometimes in keynotes, and like, who sees themselves as a leader? If it's like a business, and maybe 10 people in a room of 100 will raise their hand. And then I'm like, well, who here has a brother or a sister, and about 90% of the people raise their hand. Like, who has kids, and another, almost everybody raises their hand. Who's married, most of the people in the room are married. Who's an aunt or an uncle, at some point, you see what I'm saying? Who has a neighbor, who's a citizen of the United States? I mean, citizen of your community, you have a leadership obligation. I've had some people argue with me about that leadership's a privilege. And I'm like, maybe it's something special, but it's there for everyone to grab it. And I do think it's an obligation. You're going to have to at some point. It doesn't mean you're going to be a CEO, but you are obligated at some point, and you will be called to leadership and to set the example and to be composed in a chaotic situation. All of us aren't going to get through life without having to deal with that. And so to me, if you learn how to be or understand the basics of leadership, it's only going to help you in that journey.
Great. Yeah, it's kind of like learning a set of attitudes and beliefs that are going to empower you and make you a more effective human being. It's kind of like how I would define it. So yeah. That's fantastic stuff. I really enjoyed this conversation, Richard. I love talking about leadership, about scaling businesses, empowering people, decentralized decision-making. I love that term. So for those listening, I hope you enjoyed this and got some good stuff from it, some actionable stuff, like that whole idea of don't react, think, be conscious, think of your intent and what's the best way to respond to any situation. That's really a good leadership trait that we can all embrace. For more from Richard, you could check out his podcast. He publishes twice a week, Dose of Leadership podcast. There'll be a link in the description of this video or the show notes if you're listening to this as a podcast. And I'll be having more guest expert speakers, as I call them, in the coming weeks and months. So I hope you'll join me for that and follow the podcast or subscribe to the YouTube channel if you haven't already. Thank you again, Richard. I really appreciate your time and your input here. Thank you all for listening, and we'll speak again soon.